What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at the Premier League match between Tottenham and Chelsea and their tactics behind this London derby. Before we get into the tactics behind the match, check out the Once Video Analyzer. It's the program I'm using to make this video. There's a link in the description below, so be sure to check that out and support the channel. Also, check out both my books and my new tactics course, all in the description below. You'll find the links there. Now let's get right into the tactics behind Tottenham and Chelsea. So the first phase we're going to look at is when Tottenham build from the back. They use asymmetry, as they usually do, with their three central defenders favoring this left side and creating an overload. Now this worked quite well against this Chelsea team and how they pressed. The double pivot of Tottenham allowed them to attract pressure and open up space for central passes for players like Harry Kane with runners in both half spaces. So what Chelsea would do to try and counter this was they would press with Kai Havertz as their lone center striker, and they would almost go with a back five with Ziyech following the wing back on this left hand side, dropping very deep, forcing Ruben Loftus-Cheek to jump and form partnerships with João Felix and Raheem Sterling. So from here, the three players would protect Kai Havertz, who would then be responsible for going pressing the first line and pressing Tottenham into the wide areas. Now Tottenham had a numerical advantage that allowed them to circulate possession if they needed and escape pressure quite easily in their first line. But when pressure would mount, they would have Enzo Fernandez tasked with controlling the space between the line and often getting drawn to one of the two inside wingers for Tottenham, allowing him to displace and allowing Tottenham to find Harry Kane. Now moving up the field, Tottenham would stick to their back three, but they would have a very systematic approach in possession. They go with their midfield four as they usually do, and we would see their typical movements with one of their two holding midfielders usually dropping into deeper areas to release one of the central defenders into the wide areas, creating overloads. But the main important part of these two holding midfielders was their role in the center of the field. They were often able to draw players like Ruben Loftus-Cheek further forward, attracting pressure and creating this space between the lines. Now here, when a midfielder was drawn out for Chelsea, we would have this space created for players like Harry Kane to drop into, and this is where Tottenham would get very dangerous. Now we know Tottenham always have their high and wide wing backs as options to progress through the wide areas. So this is always a fail-safe for them where they can then rely on crosses into the box. But with Harry Kane in the team and his ability to drop into the space between the lines to pick up the ball, and especially when Enzo Fernandez is drawn towards the half spaces, opening up this passing angle for Harry Kane, they can then use Harry Kane through the center and have Kulusevski and Richarlison running through the half spaces supporting him, narrowing the back four and threatening him behind, which would then be an avenue where they could find their wingbacks, creating full width up the field. Now Chelsea tried to counter this with a makeshift back five. We see Reece James playing very narrow and their back four generally operating very narrow. So now Reece James has to jump to Richarlison to prevent free players from popping up between the lines, and what would happen, Hakim Ziyech would be forced to play a right wing back role. So then this would put a lot of emphasis on Ruben Loftus-Cheek and Enzo Fernandez. Ruben Loftus-Cheek would often jump forward, in line almost with João Felix, creating staggering in their midfield and having Kai Havertz operating as the highest player forward. But there was a lot of staggering within their midfield and often conceding space in dangerous areas, and often allowing Tottenham to find Harry Kane and defeat, but also with their asymmetry within their team, it created a spatial problem, often allowing an outlet out wide for Tottenham and not allowing them to trap possession and win the ball back in advantageous ways. Now, one of the biggest keys for Tottenham in any match is Harry Kane in transition. So in this match, Tottenham were able to find Harry Kane quite often, which made them even more dangerous. Then with Kulusevski and Richarlison as willing runners through the half spaces, along with the two holding midfielders as support, it made Tottenham very dangerous because these five players were crucial for transition. Their ability to keep the ball, find feet, and make threatening runs in behind was very impressive. Then we also have the late runs of the wingbacks as an outlet if Spurs can't continue the attack forward in a very fast manner. So this protected them from losing the ball again and getting overextended because of the two holding midfielders, but they also remained the threat with the runs in behind through the half spaces. Now, out of possession, Tottenham kept it very tight with their midfielders' connections and the horizontal connections of these players, and their back five protected them quite well and really limited the space between the lines. So now Chelsea, what they lacked was a player able to find these forward diagonal passes into their more dangerous players. But also Tottenham would bait them into making these passes and risk a central turnover and transition for Tottenham going forward. So oftentimes Chelsea would play safe and use their back four as horizontal circulation. So what would happen was the back four would usually create width. They'd have some freedom and fluidity for the fullbacks to narrow and players like Sterling and Kai Havertz to fan out wide. But generally our back four created width. Enzo Fernandez was the staple holding midfielder. Ruben Loftus-Cheek would also have the fluidity to join him to change the shape, but the three players in midfield who played further forward often came in the form of Raheem Sterling, João Felix, and Ruben Loftus-Cheek between the lines. So these three players were the base of the attack of Chelsea, looking to create superiority between the lines. And not only were they not accessible for Chelsea, these players between the lines, but they could have operated with some numerical superiority to try and generate these advantages for Chelsea. But Chelsea didn't target the two holding midfielders, and they didn't take advantage of pinning from Kai Havertz to hold the back line and specific center backs to their last line that would then have created space. Also, the positioning of these players between the lines is slightly off. So if we take the player of Raheem Sterling, for instance, he's positioned in the same distance from the midfielders as he is to the defense. So by positioning himself, he limits his ability to turn between the lines, and he limits the ability to use a third man concept to get the wing backs involved. So now if we just change the positioning of him slightly, and if he positions slightly deeper, the passing option from the holding midfielder to Raheem Sterling between the lines would decrease, and he'd have more space to turn into. Now, on the flip side, if he started higher up the field, he'd have more space to operate and connect the fullback in possession. So by starting higher, he'd also pin defenders, be able to drop back into the space and access it dynamically. But with the stagnant approach from these Chelsea players, they didn't help Enzo Fernandez in the first line of build-up by positioning too high, but they also didn't help the fullbacks getting forward and even the wingers creating isolation when they would fan out wide by positioning in this central role. So now as the game progressed, the stagnant Chelsea remained the same and their problems continued, especially in the final third. So we have our back five from Tottenham that stayed very disciplined and had aspects of man orientation and spatial orientation, with the wide fullbacks being more attracted to the half space to limit the opportunities Chelsea would be able to generate between the lines while leaving the most central defender free. Then the midfielders would stagger themselves and look to step and cover one another by prioritizing the central areas. This would often lead to Chelsea continuing their horizontal passing from fullback to fullback and from holding midfielder to holding midfielder. So here we have Enzo Fernandez being accompanied by the substitute for Chelsea, coming deeper, creating a double pivot. This allowed the wingers to fan out wide and create more width, but created a very flat attacking structure. So with João Felix making runs in behind was rarely often used. His focus came on accessing the space in behind, where Kai Havertz occupied the last line, and now we have no players between the lines to use the space when Oliver Skipp jumps out. So we have Kai Havertz pinning, but now João Felix with the runs in behind essentially does the same job with no players threatening between the lines. Now on the flip side, we have players between the lines, but no partnership for him to pin. So with this movement, they'd have to look to deliberately attract central defenders, look to move forward, and then get in behind through the wide areas. But these movements and consistency within the movements was missing for Chelsea, which led to a lot of their problems in possession. Now I hope you guys liked the video. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the match, and I'll see you in the next one.